So I am actually here to introduce someone that I have actually known in the community for a while. I moved to San Francisco in 1991 and came out of the closet. It was not safe for me to do so where I was living before that. And I was raised in Alaska as a half-breed, mixed blood. I have Native on both sides of my family. Some members of my family can pass, some members of my family can't. In Alaska, I don't really pass. They take a look at me and they can see that I'm mixed blood. When I moved down here, I all of a sudden passed. And it was the first time in my life that I had actually passed. And it was quite the experience for me. And when I came to San Francisco, I didn't know anybody. It was terrifying coming from an island with 17 miles of road. And here I was in this big, big space, and I was looking for Native people, try to round out my community. I was looking for queer Native people, find people I could relate to. And it took me a while to actually find them. But one of the places that I found was in a book that kind of changed my life, because it was the first time I had ever read a book that talked about being mixed blood. And growing up in a place that really hates Native people, it was kind of a revolution to me to think about myself as a mixed blood, because I just had always thought of myself as Native. And it was like this opening for me that was, I don't know if I can describe it, but it felt like coming home. And the name of that book is called Loving in the War Years. For me, it changed my life and how I viewed myself. It allowed me to take up space and take up less space in certain areas. And it allowed me to claim parts of myself that I had never really claimed. And so it is my distinct honor to introduce Cherríe Moraga today.
Thank you. You know, I thank Joe and Wolf, but everybody who shows up, everybody that drops a coin in the bucket and everything. It's really important. It's always unimaginable to me a little bit. We just came out of the Old Butch group. I always have to kind of say it like that. The Old Butch group, Old Butchs, Old Butches. Would just be old bulldaggers, old butches. That's how it always feels to me. I can't say it, old butches, old but no, it doesn't work. Anyway, I say that because it was a really big deal to me. It was a big deal to sit there among those women. It was really, really a big deal. And it's kind of hard to explain that, but maybe what I'm going to read to you today a little bit will try to explain that. And this has been a hard thing to write. And I offer it to you in the way I understand how one offers things traditionally. That is, it is an ofrenda that I give you of my questions, my concerns, my preoccupations, and my opinions. And I offered them to you in the spirit, especially of an intergenerational conversation. I asked the conference organizers to open with this video because I think it shows in a personal way what it means to have queer origins, to be queer before a politic is attached to it. In my story, there was also a particular color and culture to queerness, again, before a politic. Like I say in the video, I just wanted to be brown. but I did not want to be queer. As a child, I knew what brown looked like, and it looked like all that I understood as home, familia, a point of departure and return. But queer just looked like exile and the end of my life. To continue, I think I need to say that I'm not so good with the current vernacular of the LGBTQIA political world. First, it's an impossible acronym. And I admit I retain some resistance to using language here that I feel may not be truly my own, not yet, not generationally, but also perhaps not culturally. I have learned as a writer to be cautious of appropriated and/or invented terms, even when well-intentioned, especially in the public world of politics. And I want to speak authentically here, and specifically, and most of all, respectfully. So, for expediency's sake, to be clear, when I say queer, I mean any place where sexuality, our sexual desire, and/or our public expression or private experience of gender do not line up with what the majority prescribes as normal. What we say to one another in private, that language is what most interests me. It is what I believe in, even as a public writer. Political concepts are transmitted through the head, but they always originate in a story. For most of us, the stories that inspired our politicization are ones of oppression, our experience of being on the receiving end of violence, discrimination, silence, or invisibility. Our story is something we return to again and again, hopefully with more insight each time, hopefully in a way where we are less negatively affected by it and can instead actively engage in a living politic, a theory in the flesh, to eradicate the source of such suffering, not just for ourselves, but for others. That's what makes it progressive politics. I can attest to the importance of our stories as I complete a memoir initiated by my mother's Alzheimer's and final passing in 2005. 250 pages later, the book has had me revisiting those epiphanies of political consciousness that occurred in response to oppression, sometimes my own, sometimes through the profound identification with the oppression of someone else. What began as a book about my mother's private amnesia grew into a book about cultural amnesia, until underneath it, memories began to resurface of a profound and invisible patriarchy, often dealt by the hand of my own Mexican mother. And in a certain way, I was back where I had started my writing life, unraveling what it was to be a mixed-blood, Mexican-American, queer child born in the middle of the 20th century. So here's one story. He had come to the Bay Area on business, but also to talk to me. I'm 25 years old, and it is 1978, a time in which my brother and I, although distant, were intermittently still speaking to each other. I just want to know one thing, he begins. We are seated at a family-owned Italian restaurant in downtown Berkeley, a fresh cocktail in front of each of us. I knew what was coming. Is it my fault? He meant the lesbianism, of course. I had just recently come out to my family, literally on the last day before my move from Los Angeles. This is 35 years ago. Somewhere, I think, in my brother's mind, he had feared that too much one-on-one basketball, high jump home training, flag football, too many wrestling and boxing matches where he laid wagers on my winning, too many jet fighter flights, he the pilot, me the ever dutiful co-pilot, hooking clothes hangers around the bars of the bedposts for steering wheels, too many World War II Army games and Cowboys and Indians where we lined up finger-sized warriors and shot them down with perfectly poised rubber bands. All this may have caused some confusion in me about gender and therefore the opposite sex. Or perhaps he feared that in his utter disregard of me once I hit puberty, he had been remiss in properly shepherding me into heterosexual womanhood. I remember marveling at the aggrandized view my brother had of his personal power, that he believed, in fact, he could cause my lesbianism. I don't remember my first response to his question, probably something arrogant in my own defense, punctuating it with, "Don't flatter yourself," which was meant to convey to him that he was not that important to me, that no, I did not envy him, that no, I did not want to be him, that no, I did not want his freedom, his power, his unapologetic access to women should he so choose. What I could never admit to myself at the time, as an emergent feminist lesbian, is that all of that was absolutely true. I envied all of it. The waitress comes over to us to freshen our drinks. We shake our heads no, and as she steps away from the table, I ask Joe, "Do you find her attractive?" And he says, after a moment's hesitation, "Yes." And I respond with as much dyke bravado that I can muster, "Me too." I wanted him to know without equivocation that I desired women equal to any straight man, and that I had the right to want and be wanted by them. In short, at that moment, and although it was more complicated than this, I framed my desire for women to my brother from a masculine place, as it arose from a female body, which growing up often felt like the wrong body. I remember being about 12 years old when my brother comes out of the shower, a thin towel wrapped around his hips, a slice of contoured thigh peeking out where the towel opened at the side. We, his two younger sisters, are in our bedroom. After his shower, he usually raced by our two twin beds and mirrored dresser to get to his own small room adjoining ours. But this time, Joe Jr. stops at the mirror and, still wet from the shower, begins to flex his muscles in a kind of parody of a bodybuilder. He exaggerates the postures before his audience of younger sisters, but he isn't really kidding. He marvels at the sudden miracle of his post-puberty body, where new muscles begin to define themselves into a running back's tight form. It is September, after a summertime of high school football weight training, and Joe Jr. knows he looks good. His exhibition is met with his sister's obligatory, "You are so gross, Joe," and a series of appropriate barfing sounds. But the truth was, I marveled at the change too. I have never found my brother handsome, but how I wanted to inhabit that body. Not the shade that mirrored my own, but the sex of it. Was it at that same Italian restaurant my brother commented to me that he had observed me once on my way home from school trying to walk like a lady, as he put it? It touched him somehow in a tender way, he said, and I remember how sickened I was to hear that story, that my brother could be that clueless about his little sister, who had trailed behind him, imitating his every move, his mannerisms, as any little brother would copy his older one. My memory of walking home from school that way, trying to get my knees to roll together like they showed us at the department store modeling classes, was pure misery. Although my sister and little cousin Cynthia were eager to sign up, it was for me holy hell. Some part of me realized the classes were mostly intended for me, and that my cousin and sister were allowed along to disguise the real purpose, to assimilate me into feminine culture, and I was in desperate need of some lessons. To not assimilate was not on the map that my family had drawn for my life, and there was no other map. As it turned out, when our girls' fashion show took place at the end of the session, I was elected to be the MC. Talk I could do. Walking like a girl was another matter. Salt on the wound, a decade later, I learned that my brother had caught me in my walk of shame on that smoggy San Gabriel afternoon, holding my thumb and forefinger together as my legs brushed past each other as instructed. I remember feeling doomed to a counterfeit life, robbed of the freedom I knew as a child, where although chided for my boyishness, mostly by outsiders, I excelled at it. Tick-tock, the game is locked and nobody else can play today. The second graders, blonde and pale-cheeked girls, would quickly form a circle of linked hands as they saw me approach. Separated from the boys' playground, I found few playmates at Holy Family Catholic School. I sensed it was because I played like a boy, rough and with a tendency to get dirty. Somehow the rejection rolled off me as the proverbial water off a duck's back, finding comfort in the knowledge that I could return home to a mother who did not judge me that way, not yet, and to a best friend, Matthew, the half-breed Sioux kid next door, whose butt I beat every time in every game we ever played, and yet he always came back for more. Still, over 50 years later, I confess, I remember that first lockout. Once I came out, I used to fantasize what my life might have been like as a male, fantasize how I would not have been the vendido my brother was, that I would have remained loyal to my Mexicanismo, that I would have early on given my mother Mexican children and brought them to her to love. I would have, I swear. But there was no Mexican man for me to be, not in the small world of this mixed blood, mixed up family of five, not in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. I could go on. It is 2003. My brother, father, and I sit in a Denny's restaurant in this utterly featureless Orange County town of fake lagoons and shopping malls. I am not in my skin. I know this meeting with the men in my family is a foreshadowing of my Mexican disappearance. They have not accepted my mother's Alzheimer's, not completely, although it is my mother's elucidated dementia that made my sister's second wedding the evening before impossible. Elvida knew better than most the marriage's futility and ended up in a hospital, it seemed, almost as a kind of private protest of it. What my brother and father could not know at that moment as we drink our watery coffee is how every cell in my body wants to run out of the place, the coffee shop, the town, the prospect of my oblivion without a Mexican mother. I wanted to gather up my queer woman and our queer children from that Super 8 motel where she slept and they watched morning cartoons and head back north to the sanctuary de Nuestra Chicanidad, where even if the Red Roadsmen were still doing that tick-tock, the game is locked routine against the arrival of our queer indigenous identities, I still had a Mexican family to go home to, just as I had as a youngster. But not at that moment. Not there among these white men. Is it possible to think so dispassionately about your own flesh and blood? By the mid-1970s, at the time of that first and last conversation I had with my brother about lesbianism, feminism helped politically locate my queerness in a way that I thought I could live with, because it, at its core, uncovered the gross and subtle manifestations of the hatred of women and women's bodies, intimately and institutionally. And this suffering I recognize. This was the heart of my oppression as I first understood it, to grow up in a time and place where to be a woman, queer or straight, of any class or color, was to be in prison. The feminist movement was a result of the critical evolution of the other freedom movements of the 60s and 70s, and as such, I thought it could not betray me. At the time, as an adult in my early 20s, I did not want to be a man, although I had wanted to be a boy. I wanted to be able to express myself as a masculine woman and to be allowed the right to be involved with women sexually, without recrimination or discrimination. But through my engagement with feminism as a political movement, I soon came to realize that this would not really be allowed me when, hand in hand with my feminist consciousness, a consciousness around race and class emerged. Because in addition to the right not to marry, in addition to the struggle to eradicate domestic violence and rape on the street and in the marriage bed, in addition to equal pay for equal work, I wanted better work and an education for our working class families. I wanted to end sterilization abuse for Puerto Rican and Mexican immigrant women. I wanted to interrupt the entrenched poverty of black single parenthood. And I wanted to wipe away forever a ruthless male-female double standard I had lived with every day in my Mexican America. And this, of course, is where things get messy. Real lives. Real lives that do not neatly fit into single-issued identities. This is where experience clashes with political correctness, party lines, and even with correct pronouns. This is where working class feminists and feminists of color in the 1980s also acknowledged that there were gender roles in some of our relationships, in our barrios and in our bars, that some of us were attracted to one another like heterosexuals, male to female, and that sometimes our expression of desire in bed looked a lot like heterosexuals, all taboo issues in the women's movement at large. Second wave feminism, as it is called, although I think women of color may have been swimming in a different ocean, was mainly instigated by white heterosexual women of economic privilege. And although lots of those women were becoming lesbians in droves in the 1970s, many did not stay lesbian because they had come to it through their heads first, not their bodies. Lesbianism was the practice of feminism they had asserted, while all along, those of us who knew we had no choice in the matter felt ourselves different because we framed our desire for women as butches or femmes, even when not openly announced. Today, I understand the sexuality of butch identity more broadly, which means butches, yes, may want women in ways distinct from men. But butches may also want butches, and butches may even want men, or to become men themselves. And if you try to explain this to someone not in the life, it will turn their head around. By 1980s, the mainstream feminist movement had pushed us out, or more accurately, we women of color had walked out. This bridge called My Back was born from the collection of these scattered, exiled, and disassembled voices. What is most important about this story is that many of us had to work very hard to have the right to a feminism that allowed us our desire, the class and color of it, even our masculine version of being women. It was hard won. We did not reject feminism but kept adding adjectives to it to continue to adapt it to our political practice. Chicana feminism, black lesbian feminism, Asian American radical women. Some changed the name to what Alice Walker called womanism, and many Latinas followed suit with mujerismo. But one thing, for my part, I did not do was identify with the lesbian and gay movement because I did not want to work with a movement that put the concerns of white men first. That's me. This became especially evident with the AIDS pandemic in the late 1980s and early 90s when men of color and later women of color were left on the sidelines of healthcare. Perhaps this is in part my hesitance to the gay marriage movement as well. I cannot disavow my feminism, although I know for some of you, feminism may seem remote and utterly antithetical to your political vision, that even the concept of womanhood itself as masculine identified people may feel oppressive to you. Still, even at 60, I witness a bitter patriarchy that would have had me dead by now had that movement to liberate women had not emerged. So for me, there is no reason to be here if we cannot employ our genderqueer selves to evolve a feminist politic that recognizes the living exploration of gender as we experience it in our bodies as a radical opening on the road to liberation. My generation My generation struggled to rot out a foundational radical women of color and queer feminism that was quickly appropriated by glass-ceiling and single-issued feminists and sabotaged by right-wing Reaganomics. Still, it is a moment from which we have all profited. I cannot pretend to not know what I know, and I know it as a genderqueer person. To completely eliminate womanhood while women are raped as an act of war in Congo leaves us with no tool to continue to wage a revolution in her name. It is as if to tell people in East and West Oakland, hey, police brutality is over, we are post-race. Are women's lives so safe under patriarchy that we can extinguish that very identity of she, even in our conversations with each other, when we have barely begun to make misogyny visible in all its permutations? There are times in my life where she sounded strange to my ear, both as it was addressed to me and as I addressed others. It didn't fit. But it is the disconnect between the she and the complexity of who we are that at times radicalizes consciousness. We try to fix the disconnect with surgery or neutral pronouns or using plurals for the singular we are. And I get it. But I worry. My partner, Celia, reminds me when we began to use Chicano, she said, oh, our people hated it. Yes, it made everyone uncomfortable, and I acknowledge this discomfort. And although 40 years later, that is not the common language for Mexican Americans, it made an irreversible impression on a movement. And this is your work as well. This new languaging is already making important, uncomfortable impressions. But I worry about any movement that is so quick to change a whole vocabulary of identity when that identity is still deeply attached to a resistance movement. I always suspect whiteness behind any progressive movement that approaches radical activism as a single-issued strategy. It will not sustain nor endure a lifetime and raises the same class and race questions here as it does on white-dominated college campuses, LGBTQI centers all over this country. Today, I perceive what I perceived 35 years ago, that a politic does not make a person, nor does a person make a politic. Only through a rigorous emotional grappling with our own identities and the history and social context of their formation can we rot out a politic that can continue to evolve and ultimately endure a lifetime. Being a butch lesbian or someone whose born gender does not line up with society's norms does not necessarily make someone politically progressive or conscious. Some butch teenagers and adults just want to be men. End of story. We can create a politic, as we continue to do today, which tries to support those people in their efforts so that they do not end in suicide or as perpetrators of domestic violence or victims of bullying or in prison. But victims themselves do not make a movement. Political consciousness does. Consciousness born out of an evolving critique of our living experience. I have watched some white women spend a lifetime defining their politics through their victimization. I've watched some women of color following their example. I don't want the same for butches of any ilk. Man up, I want to say to us. And by that, I mean require yourself to uncover your own sites of courage. We are no longer teenage boys. I do not understand a masculinity in a gender-born woman who hates women, although I understand the self-hatred that makes that possible. Masculinity that respects women just makes you a dick. I have been a dick And I promise you, it is my ugliest self. A progressive movement for the liberation of gender requires a masculinity that deeply, deeply remains identified with the oppression of women. It does not make she a dirty word, even when it is thrown at us. In 2011, I published a collection of writings entitled The Chicana Codex of Changing Consciousness. One of the last essays completed in the book, Still Loving in the Still War Years, began to explore some of these same questions. On Keeping Queer Queer was the essay's subtitle, and although initially started in 2008, it was one of the hardest essays to complete because my writing could not keep up with the evolving political changes in the gay marriage and transgender movements. But also my mind kept changing, evolving, as it has today in this writing. I know that as a writer, that if you sit around and wait to have answers, you will have very little manifested work in your life. Sometimes you simply just have to be full enough to ask the questions. So here are some of the questions I could not quite formulate in that essay that are in fact one question. We understand that gender identity does not always match up with our birth-assigned sex. But do our born sex characteristics shape to any degree the people we are? If sex doesn't matter, how is it then an intersex person who as a child had their gender surgically determined for them, how is it that they can still express missing their other sex self? If racial memory exists in our chromosomes, which I believe, does sex also carry memory? In an equitable, non-hating world, non-woman-hating world, with the complex arrangement of our chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs, and genitalia impact us any differently? If sex matters, and gender is not just a social construction, might not we, and these are on quotes, might not we he, she's, we hermaphrodites, we queers, we trannies represent an aperture to another side of knowing from our own body stories? And the last question, is this not the indigenous notion of two-spirit? The last question is the question. From an indigenous point of view, I wonder if all the pronoun considerations created by the white dominant LGBTQI movement can effectively map the way queer people of color need to walk our struggle. I always wonder how it might be different were we to access the ways our ancestors understood queerness. For some of us, that ancestor might just yesterday have been sitting out on the stoop playing dominoes with her brothers. I have encountered many people of color in my travels and in my years, carrying living indigenous histories, who speak of queer origins where the multiple configurations of sex and gender were allowed their own complexity before colonization. Is our goal now to just fit into our colonized identities? The question I posed in that 2010 essay stays with me still. When we want to get out from under oppression, is there a roadmap to liberation that does not collaborate with our oppressors? We live in a bifurcated world where we are she until we are he. As a mixed blood Chicana, I do not say I am biracial. I say I am Chicana because it is a politic I practice, because it is a living practice, because I grew up in a Mexican home, but that does not necessarily change how a stranger perceives me on the street. Our self-naming comes with contradictions, but fundamentally we need to uphold an abiding commitment to walk in the body of our beliefs, politically correct or not. Several weeks ago in July, members of La Red Chicana Indígena met with a small gathering of members of the Brown Boys Project in Lake Merritt Park. My beloved Celia, whom I experienced as femme, although for her, for the most part in the public world, she has never been treated like one, was eager to attend. Not, she told me, as an ally, but as a two-spirit indigenous woman who recognized brown boys as members of her nation without even having to meet them. Because as indigenous people, we are not strangers to queerness, not if we can extricate ourselves from colonization. So, Moraga, you sit there on the grassy grounds, surrounding a peopled and glistening lake. The sun is going down behind this circle of fine and youthful butches, Latina, Indígena, Africana. The sun and their smiles are so bright, you got to cover your eyes to hear sometimes. Then their voices begin to gradually fade as you think about all the places you have resided in your life, all the roads you've walked. From your first Mexicano familia to your lesbian feminism, your women of color feminism, your indigenous Chicanismo. And ultimately, it all comes back down to this. Because in this place, with these brown boys, you see your earliest sense of self reflected. Because these boys know what it is to carry the secret of their identity in their hearts when they were not free to speak it. These boys know what it is to be without place in this world. These boys carry women of color memory in their literal loins. And all you hope for is that they will not betray what their bodies know to be so. All this core questioning about gender must return us home in this way. The best stories ever told is when the mother loves her female-born, now trans child so much she says the word he to him and means it. I have done this with my own once butch daughters. And queer as I am, it has been a hard single syllable to shape in my mouth until it is repeated enough over and over again to be effortless. But this takes work and commitment and a daily engagement with our families of blood or heart. In the 2 years of the time since the completion of Still Loving Essay, I still struggle with many questions. I know that queer relations matter. I know that especially for people of color communities that our elders matter. And this is my reason for being here today, really. But the deal is, you have to really listen. Even when we use old school language, you have to imagine a world that came before you and what it was like to make love and politics there. And ask yourself how that world made your world possible. And why it matters. Not out of some easy nostalgia, but because knowledges were transmitted back in the day of which you have been strategically deprived, so that your movement will be weakened by amnesia. Do not let this happen. I want to believe in you. I want to believe, as I have written before, that your bodies walking outside the borders of your born sex, whether scarred by surgery or scarred by life, that your bodies can serve as queer models of great radical feminist resistance. Looking back, this is what I wanted for us, and this is what I look forward to in you today. Omateo. Thank you very much. I can never look at my mujer because she makes me cry. She'll be there applauding, like, oh. Anyway, thank you so much for receiving my words. I really appreciate it. It means a lot, a great, great deal to me, more than probably you know.